You need to grow up. You need to take this life more seriously and you need to work harder. That is mostly terrible advice. I should take a step back and explain what I'm on about. My name is Dr. Matt Williams. I'm a tutor in politics and what is known as the Access Fellow here at Jesus College at the University of Oxford. Jesus College is one of 39 colleges that make up the University of Oxford. It's a little bit like how the United States of America is made up of 50 states, or the UK is made up of various counties. Oxford University is split up into colleges. This one's called Jesus College. It was founded in the 16th century. It had a religious mission. That's why it's called Jesus College. It doesn't have that religious mission anymore, but we've kept the name. Anyway, why is telling people to grow up not very good advice if you want them to excel at universities, highly competitive universities like this, or indeed at any sort of competitive job? Well, I'll explain to you with a couple of explanations. But first of all, I just want to tell you a bit more about what Access Fellow means. So Access means that I travel around the UK and I visit communities and schools that are very poorly represented at universities like this, usually on account of relative socioeconomic disadvantage. And I try and encourage more people to think of themselves as proper competitors, as truly competitive at universities like Oxford. And there's quite a lot of skepticism and doubt about that. And it tends to be along the lines of, well, but you wouldn't really want someone like me applying to a university like Oxford. And that is really heartbreaking to hear, because it's totally not true. I mean, it's not only not true, but it would be devastating to universities like Oxford if we didn't take advantage of everyone's talents from all over the world, all over the country. Because, you know, we're trying to deal with some really important problems here at Oxford. We're trying to, you know, tackle climate change, we're trying to cure cancer, we're trying to make artificial intelligence safe, we're trying to improve human rights protection, and we can't do that without everyone's help, right? We need all of the talents. And so that sort of sense of this isn't a place for someone like me is genuinely devastating and damaging. And it's not only damaging for Oxford, but perhaps more obviously it's damaging for people that say that to themselves. There's a couple of ways in which you can read that sentiment, that sense of not for someone like me. I mean, the first is sort of genetic. There's this sort of idea that, you know, I'm not born right, I'm not born special enough, I wasn't born with a massive brain and an enormous IQ, so how could I possibly compete against someone? It would be a bit like saying, you know, I couldn't perform as well at basketball against someone who was born a bit taller than I am. The problem with that argument is that unlike height, which is quite strongly predicted by genetics and inheritance, academic skill is not. So there is no positive evidence for the role of genes in academic success. A lot of what people see as sort of the relative success of people in academic life is nothing to do with what they were born like or any sort of genetics. It's more to do with support they might have had or motivation they've got. You know, basically IQ is not a heritable trait. It's not something that you can inherit from your parents. And that's really good news, because it means that everyone has the capacity to perform really well. There's a really important example of this, which is London taxi drivers. London taxi drivers quite often from working class communities, quite often from backgrounds where they didn't necessarily perform that well academically in school, and were told as much. They were told, well, you're not a particularly academic character. But London taxi drivers have to do this test called the Knowledge, where they actually have to learn more facts than you would have to learn in a law degree. And as a consequence of learning all these facts, which is how to navigate the city of London without using any maps, their brain grows, it physically grows. And this sort of reveals a crucial truth about human brains, which is that they are adaptable and plastic. And that is fundamental to the human condition, right? That's what marks us out from other species. You know, other species might be able to instinctively walk, hunt, swim, and so on very quickly after birth. Humans, of course, can't do that because our brains have to adapt to our environment. But they never stop adapting, right? Your brain is incredibly adaptable and plastic. And so the only thing that would sort of put limits on that capacity to grow and develop is you saying that, oh, I'm not born right. But I'm afraid there's just simply no evidence for that. The other way in which people might say, well, you know, I can't possibly compete, you wouldn't want someone like me, is more sort of sociological than biological, in the sense that someone might think, well, I couldn't compete against someone who's had extraordinary levels of privilege in their life. They've had all of this money spent on their education. They've had all these experiences that I just don't have access to. And there's no way in which I can compete with that. Now, that is a much stronger argument. You know, there is a lot of evidence to suggest that privilege and luck really counts. And, you know, can say so as much as someone who has come from, you know, a very fortunate, very privileged background. So I completely recognize that there is something to that. But again, the idea that it's simply impossible to compete if you haven't had those sort of head starts in life, It just doesn't bear out in the evidence. And there's an extraordinary amount to which people can still do in order to make themselves competitive. And fairly obviously, the one thing to guarantee that you won't be competitive at universities like Oxford or in competitive careers is if you just don't try, if you don't enter the race at all, if you write yourself off when you say it's not for someone like me. Even though there are plenty of people from all sorts of backgrounds, all sorts of privileged and underprivileged backgrounds at universities like Oxford. And as I've already mentioned, we need you. It's not a need that we want people from all backgrounds to apply. We need you, right? We need you to solve all of these really difficult problems. So what has this all got to do with not growing up, not being terribly serious? Well, when I teach students here in Oxford how to think, I perhaps surprisingly teach them to be a lot more childish in their thought processes, because it's really powerful, right? Children have the right way of thinking about the world and the universe. So this is not sort of me being a bit silly. Honestly, there's some science behind this, that the way children think is really powerful. And for those of you watching who might be on the sort of cusp of adulthood, you might be young adults, and you might be thinking, well, childhood is just a source of shame and embarrassment. That is just a time of my life that I want to leave well behind and regret and never talk about. I can understand that, right? As we grow up, we tend to be a little bit sort of embarrassed about some of the things that we might have done or might have said, and we want to sort of become adult as quickly as possible. We want to mature because that feels like the only sort of route to progress. But there are a few things that we ought to really cling on to and really cherish about childhood, especially in cognitive terms, in terms of how you think. So there are at least 3 distinct advantages to the way children think that adults could absolutely learn from. The first, and perhaps most obvious of which, is that children are slower and more deliberative in how they think. Adults tend to think at sort of 100 miles an hour. They tend to have sort of certain frameworks for working out puzzles, and they just apply those in all sorts of situations, even if they don't fit. So they will just sort of launch into a response, right? As soon as a new scenario, new problem emerges, they will just come up with the same sort of answers every time. Whereas children will start from the beginning and will slowly work their way through it, because they're just not that sure of what the correct answer is. And that links to the second distinct advantage of a child's mind, which is that they are very open-minded, right? They're constantly aware of how little they know. And that's one of the most important things of a place like Oxford. This is not a university full of know-it-alls. This is a university full of think-it-alls. It is literally impossible to know it all. It's impossible to even know almost anything with absolute certainty. So the idea that we all sort of wander around scratching our chins and thinking about how clever we are is just not in the least bit true. We are intellectually humble, just as children would be. And so you've got to keep an open mind, you've got to listen to other people's perspectives, you've got to be willing to challenge your own views, just as children are incredibly adept at doing. The third distinct advantage of a childlike mind is that they tend not to say no to themselves. A few negatives in there, but what I mean by that is that they won't, for example, say, I'm not going to put my hand up and say what I'm thinking because, I want some answers. Children are also not going to care about making mistakes by saying things that could be wrong, because they just want to learn. Whereas young adults and adults are much more likely to sort of keep quiet. I don't want to say that. I don't want people to think I'm an idiot. I'm not going to speak up. I'm not going to practice anything because I might get it wrong. But if you recognize that it doesn't matter, you can only get stronger if you practice. As with anything in this life, if you want to be more skilled at something, you've got to practice. And practice means making mistakes and getting some things wrong. But it's very difficult to get things completely wrong in academic terms because, there's so much that we don't know, as I said already. And children are much more likely to just dive in and ask all sorts of open-minded questions. And I can sort of say this from a degree of personal experience. I'm the father of 2 young children, 7-year-old and a 3-year-old, Teddy and Jasper, and they are right in that sort of phase of life where they are full of questions, right? They are confronting the world and its wonder, and they are just ripping it to shreds, in the sense that they're asking me things like, why is the sky blue? That old classic. They're also asking me things like, what are hiccups? And why do songs get stuck in my head? And why is blue my favorite color? And how does the sea get salty, but not so salty that it doesn't kill all the fish? And all of these sorts of incredibly open-minded, fantastic questions, which show that they're not allowing the world to just, wash over their heads, which is what adults do. Adults just wander around thinking they know everything, and they never stop and just glory at how amazing the world and the universe around them is. And that is to their cost. They are disempowering themselves every second they stop thinking. And adults, I'm afraid, tend to stop thinking almost from the moment they wake up. So the idea that you should grow up, be terribly serious, think like an adult, I'm afraid it's actually a big mistake, and it's going to make you less competitive at university like Oxford. And it can also filter into this sort of sense of, oh, you wouldn't want someone like me because I don't have the skills, I don't have the luck, I don't have the IQ, but you can develop those skills. If you think more childishly and you practice, you can 100% develop those skills. And I'll explain specifically what sort of exercises you can do in order to make yourself more childlike in your thinking and therefore smarter. So what are you supposed to do? How are you supposed to think more childishly? How do we actually teach this to students at Oxford? Well, take a look at this magnificent image that you can see around me here and make some observations about it. I want you to try and notice details in this image. You might want to pause the video, you could have a chat with people around you, but have a good old think about what you can see here. Okay? Now, the more sort of grown-up way of trying to make observations is to work out, well, what do people want me to say here? What are the important facts? And so they might, for example, say, first of all, well, this is the flag of the United States of America, which of course is correct. And they might say, well, it's got 50 stars in the top left quadrant, which is also correct because there are 50 states in America. Some of you might be aware that there are 13 red and white alternating stripes because of the 13 original colonies of the US. So there are various sort of facts that people tend to quite reliably know about this image, and they prioritize that. So when they're looking at the image, when they're trying to notice things and make observations, they tend to notice the stuff that they've been told to notice, told to prioritize. Now, children just don't do that. And as a consequence, children tend to notice more stuff and come up with more original and insightful observations, which is what makes them often more powerful thinkers. So obviously nothing wrong with saying that this is the US flag and it's got 50 stars and 13 stripes. That's all correct. But if you want to solve the sorts of problems that we haven't yet solved in the world, you've got to think a bit more differently. And to think differently is just a skill, just takes practice. It's not a gift. There's nothing to do with genetics. It's not that some people are born capable of this and some are not at all. So you just got to practice, right? And so the way to practice is to imagine you've not seen this flag before in your life, that you're about sort of 5, 6 years old and you're full of bewildered questions about it. Okay, so perhaps try again, pause the video if you like, take another look at the image, and this time, imagine it's the first time in your life you've ever seen it, because it's quite a strange collection of shapes and colours, and it's really fascinating, and there's lots of details you might start to notice. So have a good old look at it, and this time without trying to work out the correct facts, but just trying to actually see it and think about it for yourself. Okay, now I tried this with my son Teddy before he knew what the flag was. And he had such insightful questions because of course he did, because he's a child. He's not genetically gifted because there's no such thing. So he just asked questions like, what's that? What do you need one of those for? Which is a great start. Why do we need flags in the 21st century? What are they actually for? I mean, you can come up with all sorts of functions for them, but is it necessary for a flag to perform those functions in this day and age? Really interesting question. He then asked, why is it that shape? Why is it rectangular? Which is a good question, right? Most flags are rectangular except for a couple of notable exceptions like the Nepali flag and the Swiss flag, but why are they so often rectangular? And when you come up with a great sort of childish question like that, have a good old think about it. Don't assume that there is a right answer out there to be discovered. In many cases, there won't necessarily be a single unambiguous correct answer to these things. So you just got to have a good old think about what makes sense. I mean, what makes sense to me about rectangular flags is that they're good for fluttering in the breeze. They're about the right proportions for a good old flutter on a flagpole. Also, it's relatively easy to manufacture rectangular things. The Nepali flag must be a bit harder to mass produce because of its unique shape. So those would be my theories, but you have a think about it for yourself. Teddy then pointed out, well, why is it those colours? Why red, white and blue? which again is a great question. And that led us down a rabbit hole about what even is colour, what does it mean for something to look blue? As you may be aware, the universe is colourless, odourless, tasteless, and so on. It just, affects the way our brain sort of determines taste and colour and shape. In other words, the objects in the world reflect colour at certain wavelengths, and our brain will interpret that as a blue thing, meaning that the way you see blue is not going to be the same way that I see it. It'll be very similar, but it won't be exactly the same. So every organism will see colour according to how their brain interprets those wavelengths of light in the universe, which is kind of amazingly cool, but it's the sort of thing that most adults just don't think about or don't even question, because they just allow the world to wash over their heads, and it's just not necessary. You don't need to be gifted not to do that. You just need to stop thinking like an adult. You need to think like a child. Okay? I mean, in fact, the answer to why the flag is red, white, and blue is not precisely known. Again, this design of the flag was created significantly by a lady called Betsy Ross. And there's no particular documentary evidence as to why those colours were chosen, so you kind of have to make some educated guesses. You could say that it was because these are the colours of liberty. The French tricolour, the Dutch tricolour are also red, white and blue. You could say that it's because they just shrugged off the British Empire and they had a lot of blue and red dye knocking about because of all the British flags they would have had to produce, so they might have produced it for those reasons. But also red, white and blue are incredibly flaggy colours. There's only one UN member state that doesn't have red, white or blue in its flag, and that is Jamaica. So, it's kind of expected that flags will have at least one of those colours, perhaps. Anyway, you have a think about it. And then you can sort of go down all sorts of rabbit holes. You can ask, well, why does the flag have 50 stars on it? Why doesn't it have something else? Why doesn't it have, 50 bald eagles or 50 baseballs, right? It's an American flag. Why does it have 50 stars on it? These stars don't even look like stars. They're pointy. Stars in the sky aren't pointy. I mean, they may twinkle to the naked eye, but they're not pointy, and they certainly don't have 5 points. And it's a bit odd that the American flag has the same design of star as the Chinese flag and the Angolan flag and the Pakistani flag. These are countries that are not always seeing eye to eye with each other, and yet they have the exact same symbol on their flags. What's that all about? Well, that is because, the 5-pointed star is the universal symbol of star by and large. Of course, there are some exceptions, but it's generally accepted. And that's because it's the Egyptian hieroglyphic for star. So when Egyptians were carving their hieroglyphs into walls and tablets and pyramids, when they wrote about stars, they drew the star with 5 points, and from there that we get it. The rest of the world inherited that universal symbol for starness. And most people wouldn't know that the American flag is therefore covered with 50 Egyptian hieroglyphs. But that's because they wouldn't ask. It's not because they're genetically incapable of thinking that way. It's because they just don't ask. They just let the world wash over them. And so they miss out. Of course they miss out, but they're missing it out through choice, not because of some, systematic disadvantage that they have suffered with. So this is what we sort of teach people to do. And the way to sort of get good at it is practice, because that's the way to get good at anything. If you want to be a better dancer, if you want to be a better cook, you've got to do a bit of dancing, you've got to do a bit of cooking, right? And you've got to practice. And this is the one way in which adults do have a distinct advantage over children. Children are notoriously bad at being task-oriented. In other words, when I ask my sons to do something, some sort of task like tidy up their bedroom, it'll take possibly days and multiple reminders for them to get even close to achieving that task. Whereas your typical adult is usually better at that. And that is clearly the one distinct advantage: discipline, routine, habit. Adults are far better at that. So somehow you've got to diarise, you've got to be disciplined about your childishness, if that doesn't sound too paradoxical. In other words, you've got to carve out time every day to think like a child. You've got to carve out some time where you are going to just stop, you're going to ask questions, you're going to keep an open mind, you're not going to say no to yourself, and you're just going to think. And you might follow up those thoughts with looking online, perhaps at YouTube to look for some answers, perhaps at Wikipedia, perhaps read some books. But you're not going to just credulously take whatever someone else says as the truth, because you're going to recognize, like a child does, that the truth is relative, and that actually we need to be much more open-minded about what we think we know, And we've got to be ready to start questioning more stuff, because by questioning more things, we get more power, we solve more problems, and we get smarter. Okay, so don't grow up except insofar as being disciplined in your practice. But even, with that disciplined practice doesn't mean that it shouldn't be fun, right? The sort of people that come to Oxford are not cheerless, serious people who never have fun. In fact, it's quite obvious that if you're having fun at any task, you'll do it better. And so you should prioritize fun. And that's another way in which children have a distinct advantage over adults, is that they tend to prioritize fun over everything else, and playfulness. And that means that they will learn faster because they'll be more motivated to do it. So if, when you carve out your daily routine of thinking like a child, you've got to make sure that whatever you're thinking about is something that you are motivated to think about, that you find interesting and fun. And for goodness sake, please don't say to yourself something like, a university like Oxford wouldn't want someone like me. There's no sense in which you're genetically deficient. That just isn't a thing in academic terms. There's no evidence for a genetic relationship to academic success. And you might have various disadvantages. It may be that you've not had many head starts in life, but that doesn't mean you can't catch up with a bit of grit and determination and stubbornness, right? Honestly, Oxford is mostly full of stubborn people rather than, incredibly bright people. It does contain incredibly bright people, but they're incredibly bright because they're stubborn, okay? So just commit, be disciplined, but be disciplined in your childishness, if that makes any sense. I hope it does. Let me know what you think in the comments below. Thank you so much for watching. I wish you all the best. Bye now.